I want to introduce myself. I'm Paula Travis. I'm the coordinator for the National Colloquium. Some of you that are students know me. Others of you are used to seeing Chris Fink do the introductions, and he was delayed in Italy because of the hurricane, so he sends his apologies for not being here this evening. But he has hopes to be back this weekend safely, so we'll get to see him again next week. I wanted to take care of just a couple of little housekeeping bits for my students, so I apologize to the rest of you, but this is the only opportunity I get to talk to them. First of all, for those of you that were planning on writing papers for the Kaplan lecture, I apologize that those questions didn't get posted onto Blackboard. So you'll see those over the weekend, and feel free to go ahead and write about that particular lecture if you are intending to do so. The time frames certainly don't apply. And then the second thing is I'd ask that you please be patient with me. Since we had 3 lectures this week, it's going to take some time for me to get through all of the attendance and all of the papers. So I want to make sure that I give you due credit by reading them. And so it might be a few days before you actually have all of that online. So thank you for your patience. Tonight, or this afternoon, I'm really excited. We have Ben Hewitt here, and this kind of came to us through the recommendation of an organization called the Innovative Farmers of Ohio. And they're going to be having a fundraising dinner this evening, and they're also having a conference tomorrow, which any of you are welcome to attend either events. There is a fee for both of those, but if it's something you're interested in, just find me afterwards, and I'm happy to provide information to you on that. The Innovative Farmers annually has a conference, and they like to bring in a keynote speaker, and it just so happened that this year that they were having Ben, and so we get the fortunate opportunity to have him speak as part of our colloquium, so we're very, very happy to have him here. One of the other things that the IFO has put together is they wanted to sponsor an essay competition, and some of you were participants in that essay competition. The theme was how to feed the world without destroying our natural resources, and so that question was posed, and we asked students to write 1 or 2 pages as a response to that. And our winner this evening is going to be introducing Ben, so I'm really happy about that. He's also going to get to present his paper tomorrow at the conference as well, so we're really happy for that opportunity. Sri Harsha is from India. He's in econ and math. Econ major, math minor, with a strong interest in philosophy. His father works for the Indian forestry, and so I asked him about his inspiration for writing the paper, and he had mentioned that due to his father's work in the industry, that he was exposed to poverty and issues of climate change, and so he's been very inspired by the situation of the depleting natural resources. So it's something very personal to him. So I'm very excited to congratulate him publicly, and I'd ask you to do the same thing as well. So please welcome Sri Harsha, sorry, I apologize, Masabathula. Thank you.
Thank you, and good evening. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Mr. Ben Hewitt. Ben was born and raised in northern Vermont, where he currently runs a small-scale farm. He lives with his wife and 2 sons in a self-built home that is powered by a windmill and solar photovoltaic panels. He is also the author of The Town That Food Saved, how one community found vitality in local food. And his most recent book is Making Supper Safe, One Man's Quest to Learn the Truth About Food Safety. His work has appeared in numerous national periodicals, including the New York Times Magazine, Wired, Gourmet, Discover, and Outside. Today, he will be discussing the economic possibilities of local food and the impact of our current system on food safety. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Ben Hewitt.
Hello? Hey, so Paula asked you, but she was way, way too nice about it. So until some of you in the back move down front, I'm going to talk like this. And we're going to be here for a really long time. It's going to be excruciating for us all. Much better. Thank you, guys. I appreciate it. I know it's rough. It's Friday afternoon. It's hard to even motivate probably to come through the door in the first place. So, yeah, it's looking better. I get lonely really easily, so it's nice to have some people close by. So I'm going to talk a little bit this afternoon. First of all, I do really appreciate you all for coming out. I know what it's like on Friday afternoon. There's so many opportunities in town here, I'm sure. So I'm honored that you chose to come out and visit with me. And I'm going to talk a little bit. I am going to go through this fairly quickly. But I would also like to encourage you. I'm one of those people. I don't really like to present so much. I don't really like to stand here and just talk at you. So if you have questions or comments, even during my presentation, or whatever you want to call it, I would really love it for you to raise your hand or just pipe up or whatever, as long as you're, semi-polite. I'm really open to that. So I much prefer to have some dialogue if you're so inclined. So what I want to talk about tonight is my experiences reporting and writing this book called The Town That Food Saved. Which I wrote now about 4 years ago, almost 3 to 4 years ago. And The Town That Food Saved is basically the story of a small town in Vermont by the name of Hardwick well, I guess I'm going to back up a little bit, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of this town, because I want you to understand why it was that I was sort of interested in writing this book. That's it, right there. That's the town. It's about 3,200 people, and it's right on the sort of southern edge of what's called Vermont's Northeast Kingdom, which is like the most remote, sort of northern territory in Vermont. It's a really small town, obviously, and it's a town that has struggled for a long time economically. And to understand some of that struggle, it's helpful actually to sort of go back to the early 1900s, when, like a lot of small towns in North America, Hardwick was actually a pretty booming industrial center. And I just want to draw your attention to this photo. I think it's totally amazing, actually, to think about what they were doing. They were towing a piece of stone that weighed 60,000 pounds with 20 teams of horses, right? So next time you're feeling real sorry for yourself in class or at your job or whatever, like you're having a really bad, hard day, I would just encourage you to think about what you might have been doing, say, only 100 years ago. So during this period, late 1800s, early 1900s, Hardwick was actually a really sort of a booming industrial town. The region was the leading supplier of building-grade granite in the world. And they were literally taking this stone and shipping it across the U.S. and even overseas in some cases. And then something happened in the 1920s. Anyone want to hazard a guess as to what that might have been that sort of put the damper on this trade? What was that? No, you're close. You're close. This was even prior to the Great Depression. It's called reinforced concrete. Right? And so if you were in the building-grade granite industry, you really did not want to see reinforced concrete come onto the market, because it basically meant that no longer did they have to ship these big pieces of stone to pour a foundation or to set a foundation. They could pour it on site from all the sort of various components that go into concrete, so much easier to get them all there. So the town, the granite industry went into a really steep decline. It took like literally a handful of years from it to have it go from being the largest building grade granite region in the world to basically nothing. And at one point, there were actually 300 operating quarries in the hills around this town. I mean, this is like a small area. So it was a huge piece of industry. And so then the town, and then of course the Great Depression came along right after that. And then the town sort of entered this long period. If I stand right here, is that going to be there? They entered this long period of sort of economic stagnation where the unemployment average in Hardwick averaged about 40% higher than the Vermont state average, and the median income was about 25% lower. So it was a town, at least in northern Vermont, that sort of had, for a long time, had this reputation as sort of being a hard times place. So the other part of this story, and the other part of this interest, is that I have a small-scale diversified farm in Cabot, which is right next door to Hardwick. So I have this, I have a real interest in small-scale, so-called sustainable agriculture. So when I saw in about 2005 all of these small-scale ag-based businesses popping up in Hardwick, all sort of purporting to be, sort of sustainable ventures, I thought that was really sort of intriguing, because I guess I'd always sort of associated that movement, the local food movement, the sustainable organic movement, with kind of more affluent communities. And to me, it was almost like someone said they were going to come and open up a Ferrari dealership in downtown Hardwick or something like that. It just didn't it kind of didn't make sense to me. So I thought that was kind of curious. And then I started hearing all these conversations around some of the owners of these businesses, some of whom I knew because I lived in the area, about how they were going to blueprint a healthy regional food system, and they were going to export that blueprint to the rest of the world so that other communities could do this too. And I thought that was either wicked smart or totally presumptuous. I wasn't sure which, but I was sort of intrigued by it. So I set out to write this book. And in the process, I sort of realized I had no idea what I was looking for. It's like, okay, these guys say they're going to do all this, and women, these men and women say they're going to do all this, but what are the metrics by which I'm going to sort of, if I'm going to write this book, by which I'm going to sort of measure their success? And so I came up with, fairly early on, the 4 commandments of local foods. And you can see my little disclaimer there. So I'm open to other suggestions. I guess my point is, these are my ideas, I think, of what a healthy food system, some of the components it should have. But I don't know that they're the only ideas out there. They're just the ones I came up with. Number 1, it shall feed the locals, right? If you're going to be talking about local food and local food systems, should it not be feeding the locals? And one of the things I sort of noted early on when I was reporting my book was that a lot of the businesses in town we're actually making sort of high-end food products that they weren't really selling in the community so much as they were trying to sell them to other markets where there was more money. I mean, I thought that was kind of interesting. I mean, what are the factors that sort of compel a business that is talking about creating a local food economy to be shipping its products to New York City and San Francisco and et cetera, et cetera? Why does that have to happen? Number 2, it shall be circular. We'll talk a little bit more about the shape of food systems in a minute, and that may make a little more sense. But number 3, it's going to be based on sunshine, all right, so that we're not utilizing heavy inputs and non-renewable fuels and feedstocks in this food system. All right, right now in this country, the way that we grow, process, and distribute food is, as a sector, the leading consumer of energy, right, ahead of transportation. Which is kind of fascinating when you think about it, because if you consider all of the sort of political rhetoric around, weaning our nation off of oil or off of, foreign oil or fossil fuels or whatever, all of which, is laudable goal, but you never, so far as I know, hear anyone talking about food as being one of the factors we should be looking at. It's almost always issues of transportation, other sources of, or other energy uses, not food. And yet, it is our leading consumer of energy. Number 4, it's going to offer viability to producers. Okay, why? What good is a local food system or any food system if the producers, the people who are actually producing the food, are going out of business? They're not really helping anybody if they're going out of business every 6 months. So you might have recognized already that we have sort of a conundrum here, and this is particularly true, I think, in a community like Hardwick with it's sort of below average median income, which is that we have, I think, a little bit of a conflict between number 1 and number 4. And it's very difficult for small-scale food producers who are producing food in what I call sort of the conscious economy, which is to say, it's food that accounts for its environmental practices. It's produced in a way that the workers are paid livable, fair wages. It's food that is actually truly nourishing. It's not just sort of the empty calories that we are generally sort of sold as food these days. It's very, very difficult to produce that food at a price that actually sort of fulfills rule number 1. And that's particularly true, of course, when you have a median income in Hardwick is less than $15,000 a year. We'll talk a little bit more about some of the reasons for that in a little bit. Okay, I promised we would talk about that's my truck. Pretty cool, huh? It's not really my truck. Come on. I do kind of like big trucks, but I don't. That's actually Bill McKibben in his truck. My fellow Vermonter Bill. Anyway, it's really there just to be emblematic of the kind of waste that goes in, it is inherent to what I call the dominant food industry. Some people call it the industrial food system. I call it the dominant food system, whatever you want to call it. But essentially what we've got right now, and the way most of you guys, the way I was raised, and the food that most of us were raised on, is food that sort of came along this path here. It's a linear food system whereby in one end you've got mostly non-renewable inputs. Seed is still renewable. However, as some of you probably know, Monsanto holds a patent that would make seed non-renewable. So seed, the source of the food that basically provides us our sort of lifeblood, could be made non-renewable if Monsanto chose to make good on its patent, which they have not, simply because there was such public outrage when their technology was announced that they tabled it, but they have reserved the right to bring that technology to bear. So you have all these non-renewable inputs traveling, approximately 1,500 miles for the average calorie in America. By the way, for every calorie that we consume, we burn 11 calories in energy to bring that to the table, right? So, wow. I mean, that's not something that's going to go on forever. I can promise you that. One way or another, that's going to have to come to an end. And the other thing I find just totally fascinating is that on the other end, we have the waste here, and we actually throw away 40% of the food that is produced in this country, right? From field to fork, 40% of it is wasted, thrown away. Yes? Right.
The waste that you're talking about, does that include like the bones of an animal and organs and things like that?
My understanding is that it includes what would be considered the edible, parts. I'm not big on bone myself, but no, I think no. I think what that means is that's food that could otherwise be utilized. But is not being because of inefficiencies in our system, by and large. The point I guess I mostly want to make, though, is that we have here's a really interesting set of statistics that sort of speak to this issue a little bit. In one sense, they also speak to the larger sort of economic issues that underline a lot of the issues around regionalized food systems. Okay, so in 1970. In the U.S., we produced 3,100 calories per capita per day. So per person per day, 3,100 calories available, right? And we had 2% of our population on food stamps. Today, we produce 3,900 calories per person per day, and we have 15% of our population on food stamps. And to me, that paints a really sort of dire picture, I guess, in a way, of this sort of artifice of abundance in all of these, food calories that we produce, and yet we have, of course, an economy where, what's 15%? 1 out of every 8 people? I don't know exactly, but a very large number of the people in this country are not able to feed themselves without assistance. All right, so this is what I call the circular food system. Food web is another term for it. And I want to make a real quick point about localized, regionalized food systems. I think, you hear a lot about people sort of putting numbers on it, like your food should come from within 100 miles or from within 15 miles or whatever it is. And one thing I sort of realized pretty early on when I was working on this book is that I don't actually think there's any such thing as a local food system. There's no blueprint. Because I think every locality, every region is going to have particular strengths and weaknesses and is going to have different needs. It's going to be populated either more densely or less densely. So it's not a static thing. So the point I guess I'm trying to make is that I think a healthy food system is much more about making these connections than it is about having these connections be within any particular locality or distance from one another. Now, I don't think you want to be looking at this as a globalized thing, but I also think that if you're really trying to make these connections in a way that these people know who each other are and they have relationships, that's also going to, in a sense, define the locality and is going to sort of make it be local. And someone actually pointed out at a talk I was doing that I thought was really astute observation was that really this should have probably a spigot on here and maybe like a funnel coming in one end, because we aren't really, I don't want you to think I'm talking about like the end of agricultural trade here. I'm not talking about like, sort of isolating communities with their own sort of brand of agriculture. We're talking definitely about, relationships and connections with other communities, but we are also talking about making these connections within a community. You guys get her done? Is that get her done? You guys get her done, right? We're big on getting her done in Vermont. So just, if you ever want to get her done, we know how to get her done in Vermont if you're feeling like it ain't happening in Ohio. One way to get her done, of course, is child labor. Because as you all know, farming's really hard work, right? I don't want to have anything to do with it. No, I'm joking. I'm totally joking. But I do want to make the point, and one of the reasons I have kids on here is that I think it is really important to make the point that we have now multiple generations of children in this country who have essentially no idea where their food comes from. And that engaging kids with agriculture is probably, I would argue, one of the most important things that we can do, and giving them some sort of sense of empowerment and sense about, like, to me it seems like insane that we have completely disconnected ourselves to the extent we have from the sort of the very source of our well-being. I mean, we would never do that with air, for instance, right? And, granted, we need air maybe a little bit more than we need food in the sense that you can live for a little while without food. But the reality is, of course, is that it's totally essential, and yet we've outsourced basically every facet of its production to multinational corporations that, frankly, don't care about a whit about you except for the money that's bouncing around in your pocket. And our kids now are growing up with no sense that it was ever any other way, when the reality is it wasn't that long ago that it was absolutely that way. Diversity. All right, this is another way of getting her done. If you want to really have a healthy, localized food system, diversity is really key for a number of reasons. One, go back to the 4 commandments, right? You're going to feed the locals. All right, well, the locals are going to want to eat more than, corn or cheese or whatever. The locals are going to demand a diverse diet. 2, diversity means that the region is not going to overwhelm its capacity to supply a particular feedstock for a particular crop. I'm just going to give you a quick example here from Vermont, which is becoming really well known as for its artisanal cheeses, for its very, very high-end cheeses. And that's great. And Vermont has a lot of cows, so that's good in a sense. But when a region tends to specialize in a product like that, what quickly happens is, oh, we have all these dairy farmers now, people wanting to make milk to make into cheese, and all of a sudden we can't grow enough hay, so now we have to start importing hay. Or all of a sudden we're over-haying or over-grazing our fields, so we've got to start importing all sorts of fertility. So diversity helps to ensure that doesn't happen. It does one other thing that I think is perhaps even less obvious, but no less important, which is that I think diversity tends to breed collaboration rather than competition. So when you have a bunch of people sort of specializing in one particular niche, all of a sudden you overwhelm the region's capacity to also absorb that product, to actually utilize that product. So A, they start shipping it far outside the region to sell it to other buyers. B, they start driving the price down to undercut their competitors. So when you have diversity in a region, then you have much more capacity for collaboration rather than competition. Regional fertility. All right, I just said there was no blueprint for a regional food system, and I actually believe that's really true, but I do think there are certain factors that should definitely be considered, and one of those is fertility. I mean, it's one thing we just don't think about as a nation anymore because we don't have to think about it because we've created all of these sort of synthetic fertility rather than, dependent on our own sort of regional, biofertility. So I do believe that just like every community should have a volunteer fire department or a sheriff or whatever, they should probably also have a composting facility. So at least if you're not utilizing the wasted food to feed people, you can at the very least be turning it into soil fertility. But the issue of soil fertility, it's amazing to me that this is everything in this room at one point came out of the soil. Right? Either, most likely not as a whole. This microphone didn't just someone didn't just sort of dig into a cave and pull this microphone out. But all of the materials that comprise this microphone at one point came out of the ground. Right? Every one of you is only alive because we have soil. Right? There are other factors that are really important like sun and rain and water, but soil is incredibly essential. When's the last time you ever heard anyone sort of at a national level talk about soil? It don't happen, right? It does not happen. Ingenuity. This is a picture of the cellars at Jasper Hill, which is one of the, oh, by the way, y'all, I've got some books out there for sale if you're all sitting on a bunch of extra cash you want to part with this afternoon. And if you want to read more about the cellars of Jasper Hill, this is a cheese business in outside of Hardwick, and what they did was they built a facility that has the capacity that allows them to take cheese from other cheesemakers and age it for them and put it to market for them. Because the hard part about making cheese isn't actually so much making the cheese itself; it's actually aging it correctly, and that's where the challenge comes. So they have tried to centralize that because they have the knowledge and they have the facility. And they can sort of then help other small-scale cheesemakers get up and running. I don't know how many of you know anything about the dairy industry in the United States, but Vermont is no different than any other state that has small-scale family dairies, which is to say they are in crisis. And they're in crisis for a lot of really complicated reasons, but mostly because fluid milk is a commodity product and farmers don't get to set the prices. So they sell their product into the market. I mean, how many of you would go out and start a business if you knew that the product you were making you were not going to be able to set the price on? How would that make you feel, right? That's what it's like to be a dairy farmer who has to, not only that, but he's got to work, or she's got to work 7 days a week, right? 365 days a year, and doesn't get to set the prices. So anyway, one of the ideas behind Jasper Hill is to be able to offer an alternative for small-scale farms in Vermont who can no longer afford to sort of ride that roller coaster of prices that are set by other people. When in 1947, Vermont had over 11,000 dairy farms, we now have 970, right? So that's a pretty steep decline. But anyway, the model, the ingenuity comes into where the ingenuity comes in is that model is very, very unique to North America, that centralized sort of aging facility. It actually is a very sort of European model, and these guys sort of brought it over from there. Y'all know what this is, so we can probably just skip right through that, right? Anybody? Give me a guess. But really, actually fairly close, but not. No one was going to say, like, squash seed extractor or something like that? No, apparently not. That is a squash seed extractor, all right? Now you know that you can, if nothing else, your years here were not wasted because you now know what a squash seed extractor looks like. And that was designed by another one of the businesses that I profiled in my book. And the idea is that you toss the squash or the pumpkin or whatever in there. They come from the cucurbit family, all of those things, those fleshy things with seeds. It gets ground up, and this drum spins around, and the seeds fall through the bottom. Pretty cool, I think. I don't know. Anyway, this is Claire's, and I put this up here just to give you a sense of what one small business, the capacity of one small business, the impact it can have on a community. And this is a restaurant that was founded in Hardwick in 2008 with a really, really strong mandate to sort of support the local producers, to the extent that over the last 4 years, 70% of their food dollars have gone to support local producers. They have paid out over $500,000 in wages and created 23 jobs. All right, this is in a town of like 3,000 people. So this is one business. You know, look, it's not curing cancer, but it's definitely making a difference. And that's one out of, you know, there are, you know, probably 6 or 7 other businesses based around food in this small town. And that thing founded on a CSR model. Anyone here familiar with community-supported agriculture? The idea that you are going to pay in to a farm operation at the beginning of the season, so the farmer has some upfront operating capital, and then in exchange for that, you basically have what's often referred to as a subscription. So every week you'll go and you'll pick up your produce or whatever it is, right? As you sort of pay back or earn back the money you paid out at the beginning of the season. Claire's did it with a restaurant. So they got 50 people to dish out $1,000 each. And so they had 50 grand in upfront operating capital, and the way they paid that back was in $25 increments. So everyone who dished out, what's 1,000 divided by 25? Is that 40? I think that's 40, right? So they had 40 $25 vouchers, essentially, that they could come in and utilize at Claire's. It's kind of smart, because if you think about it, most people when they go out, or at least when I go out to eat, I have like 7 or 8 drinks, plus, right? That was better than that. Come on. I usually have one modest glass of beer or glass of wine, right? But they have something. They have something to drink. Maybe they have dessert. Maybe they bring in a friend who wouldn't have come otherwise. So, in short, what I'm saying is they're bringing in more than $25 worth of business, right? So they're actually, you know, I think gaining extra business by utilizing this model. Food Venture Center. All right, one of the issues and one of the reasons I wanted to write a book about food safety was I realized that one of the sort of barriers to creating these small-scale businesses is a regulatory environment, usually around the issue of food safety, that's tilted really, really heavily in favor of large-scale food producers, right? So what I'm saying is if you're a small-scale producer and you want to make, you know, cheese or whatever it is, you're generally going to have to invest in many, many thousands of dollars worth of equipment, go into debt, or, you know, spend all your money, whatever, go into debt, which then puts you in a position of having to raise your prices, right, out of reach of the locals so that you can now pay back your debt. And it's sort of this, you know, sort of treadmill to nowhere. And so one of the ideas behind the Food Venture Center, which was constructed in Hardwick a couple of years ago, or about a year and a half ago, is to remove that burden by creating a centralized facility that passes all the regulatory, you know, the regulations that people can rent or lease by the hour, rather than having to invest all of that money in their own sort of private enterprise. And these things are actually springing up all over the place all of a sudden. And it's actually, I think, really encouraging, because one of the huge issues, of course, around, you know, regionalized food systems is distribution. I mean, you can actually ship your product out of here. It creates a sort of centralized distribution point as well. Any questions? Any comments? Yes?
I was just thinking about early on you referred to the people that you were observing that were starting local food kinds of things, and you described them as so-called sustainable.
Ah, right. Yeah, yeah. Okay, so, well, I think there's a couple of reasons. The primary reason is that I think that we don't think very carefully about what is truly sustainable. So I hear a lot of talk about sustainable agriculture, and I see, actually, I was talking with Paula on the way up here about Monsanto's sustainable agriculture ad campaign. Right? If there is a model that is about as far from sustainable as it can possibly get, it's the model that Monsanto is following, right? So I think, in a sense, we have, and I'm not saying we should just sort of give up that word to the corporate interests, you know, but I also think that we sometimes sort of fail to be really cognizant of what sustainable really truly is. And so I hear talk of sustainable agriculture from people sitting up on their 100-horsepower tractors talking about how sustainable their farm is. That's not sustainable. I mean, what is the context for sustainability, right? Is that sustainable for the next 10, 20 years? Yeah, maybe so. But I think, you know, if you're just sort of saying, you know, blanket statement that something is sustainable, then I think the bar has better be pretty freaking high. And I don't think any of these, including myself on my own farm, we use a tractor, we use fossil fuels. Is that truly sustainable over the long term? I don't think so. Tell me. Keep going.
Well, so in that, you know, the title of your book is the town that food saved.
Mm-hmm.
In that surrounding area where the food is being produced locally, is there a mix of some people that you would say are not really farming very sustainably at all, and others that are really working hard to farm?
Yeah, can everyone hear her? All right, does everyone know what she's asking? Okay. Yes, I would say there's a mix. I will also say that I'm not sort of saying I can't think of any of these businesses that are sort of on the soapbox, sort of preaching about how sustainable they are. It's my observation. You know, when I say, you know, this is sort of when I say so-called sustainable. You know, there's sort of a lot of conversation right now in this country about sustainable agriculture, and I'm sort of lumping some of this stuff into that mix. It's not so much that they're trumpeting sustainability, but I think as a culture and society, we're starting to think about what sustainable agriculture is, and I think some of our thinking around that is a little bit flawed, I guess. So when I say so-called sustainable is a little bit of cynicism probably that comes from seeing companies like Monsanto market themselves as being sustainable, and also from some of the conversations I hear, not necessarily in Hardwick, but around the subject of sustainable agriculture, because I think I believe that we are not thinking critically enough about sustainability. That's what I think. I'm going to get to this a little bit more in a second, and so in a little bit more optimistic direction, all right? So if you'll bear with me, but you're welcome to interject then also. I would be curious what you think. Okay, so maybe some of you think this doesn't make any sense, right? To sort of create regionalized food systems and, you know, try to create regionalized economies around those food systems, and that's fine. You don't have to really agree with me, but since I'm the guest and you're polite, why don't you just pretend to agree with me, at least for right now? This does make sense, right? And I know, you know, from the number of times that I'm sort of asked to come talk to other communities, that a lot of communities are thinking about this and they also think it makes sense and want to move in this direction. And yet they struggle, you know, I know over and over and over with trying to make this stuff happen in their communities, just like we struggle in our community. I don't want has anyone in here read this book? All right, cool. Thank you. All right.
Well, I'm actually on disc 6 of the audiobook.
All right, cool, right.
I read the part about the dinner that's $65.
Yeah.
I thought it was ironic that there's
Right, thank you for, yes. So, the reason I ask that, because anyone who's, and the point I want to make is anyone who's read the book will know that I don't really necessarily feel like we got it all figured out. And this is not a bunch of like people, you know, sort of sitting around a campfire singing Kumbaya and eating like pastured pickled organic pig's feet or something like that, right? There are very real sort of issues and tensions and contradictions inherent to what's going on in our community that I see in other communities. So I'm not here to sort of say that, you know, Hardwick, Vermont has got this nailed, right? I'm here to say that we struggle in our community with a lot of the same expectations, policies, and big fat lies, right, that other people are struggling with. Number one, the notion that food should be cheap. Why should food be cheap? Anyone got it, right? Just because you want it to be? You're used to it. Let me ask a question. How many people in here have hired a prostitute? That's funny. Usually tons of hands go up, right? Okay, so the point I'm trying to make here, in the absence of having hired a prostitute, okay, eating food is the most intimate act of commerce you're ever going to engage in, right? You get it? You're putting it in your body, right? 3 times or more a day. It's not that funny. Stop, okay? We got to go on here. No, seriously, no, come on, because this is serious. I mean, this is like, you know, this is something you're putting into you. Why should why should it be chosen on the basis of cost? And if it were to be chosen on the basis of cost, shouldn't it be chosen on the basis of whatever, you know, perhaps the highest quality to the extent that that's an indication of its highest cost to the extent that's the indication of its quality, right? That's what I want for my body, you know? I want the highest cost, what I want is the highest quality food. If that so happens to be the highest cost, which it often is, then I'm going to be willing to pay that. Yes.
Okay, well then, for the people who are stuck in, poverty-stricken areas,
Right.
who really need
Right.
food, organic food,
Right.
how do we compromise? Because you need to help the farmers, you need to pay them
Right.
work, but we also need to be feeding people who can't afford.
Yeah, next question, please. This one's too hard. No, you're totally right. And I want to acknowledge that, I've got these these little parentheticals here. I can't afford local food. There are people, no question, in this nation and around the world who can't really, for very good reasons, cannot afford local food. No question. We've subsidized food in totally the wrong way. I mean, remember those statistics I was telling you about the percentage of people on food stamps versus the amount of calories? What that really tells is a story of what we've done with our agricultural subsidies, which is to subsidize, the mass production of really low quality foods, essentially. And the other thing that does is it creates an environment that basically extracts wealth from all these rural communities, so that the people now in these communities have to go on food stamps in order to buy the crappy food that's making them sick. Essentially, that's the short version of the story. But you're absolutely right. At the same time, I do believe that we have an issue with prioritization in this country. And so we live in a culture that will happily camp out, in Midtown Manhattan for 24 hours to get the new model of the iPhone, right? Or that will, I just know, because I see it in my own community, that people are willing to spend money on certain things and not on others, right? I don't really fault people for that, because we have been sold a bill of goods, by the manufacturers of these products. We've been told and sold, that this is what's important, and this is how we should judge ourselves, and this is how we should feel good or bad about ourselves based on the things that we buy. I mean, and I live in a blue-collar working-class community, so, me and my buddies will sit around talking about the relative merits of like a Ford versus a Chevy diesel motor, right? I mean, Chevy, obviously, but the point is, who cares, really? Who cares about the different flat screen TVs or the different smartphones? Really, but this is the stuff that dominates our consumer consciousness on a national scale, right? So there are still, of course, you're totally right, and I don't want to sound tone deaf to that reality, but I also think that sometimes the truth is not entirely politically correct. And I think the truth in this case is that a lot of people make decisions that are not in their best interests in this regard. I don't have time to cook, right? Again, another reality is that some people don't. If you're a single parent working 2 jobs to keep any food on the table, it's probably true. You probably really don't have time to cook. But check this out. In 2010, Americans set a record for television watching, 34 hours a week. Right? If you include all other forms of digital media, we're up to 53 hours a week on average in front of a screen. So anyone who's spending 53 hours a week in front of a screen has got some freaking time to cook, I'll tell you that much, right now. I promise you. The tomato fallacy, we can probably skip that one because you all know it. Come on. Oh, thank you. That's what I was looking for. The tomato fallacy, I can tell you a little story. So about 5 years ago, my wife and I took our kids on what we Vermonters call a white trash vacation, which means I got on Craigslist and I bought the cheapest Dodge van I could find, and I gutted the inside and I built a bed in the back of it, and we packed the kids in and we drove down to Florida to go camping. It was pretty cool, actually. It was really fun. Florida is this weird. How many people? Anyone here from Florida? But you've been there. How many people have been to Florida? Yeah, it's this kind of weird mix where you go through like strip mall hell for like hours, and you're like, does it ever end? And then all of a sudden it ends, and you're in this amazing piece of wilderness. And the Florida actually has quite an amazing state park system, which is really inexpensive and really accessible. And so we went down there and we spent 2 months just like going around kayaking and biking and stuff. It was really cool. It was also right at the beginning of the big housing crisis down there, and so we were all this young family, driving around this rusty old van with all our stuff hanging out of it, and everyone was, I think, had assumed we'd lost our house or something like that, because they kept inviting us in to eat and stuff. It was really good. It was like the best freeloading vacation I'd ever gotten. But the tomato fallacy came about because we were driving down, I think it's 90 that runs north-south there, Interstate 90. And on the northbound lane, we're driving south, northbound lane, there's this tractor-trailer truck coming up with open mesh sides and had all these green balls in it. And I said to my wife, oh, honey, look, there's a tennis ball factory down here. They weren't tennis balls. They were tomatoes. Which of course are, Florida is like the leading tomato producing state in the union. And they pick them green because if you pick them when they're actually ripe, they don't ship very well. And then they gas them when they get to some sort of processing facility so that they turn, sort of reddish. And the tomato fallacy is the idea that that tomato is the same tomato that you might grow on a vine in your backyard. And that really the only, and this applies to really almost any piece of food, that just because it looks vaguely similar, it's actually, of the same quality, and that the only way to really judge its merits is price. That's the tomato fallacy. Regulations, we could spend all day just talking about these next few. I just want to make one other point. Zoning, we have chosen as a culture, it's really kind of crazy if you think about it. We have chosen to live very distinct and separate from the very source of our nourishment. So we have zoning laws in most urban and some, and suburban communities in this country that disallow any kind of real food production, right? And think about that for a second. We're human beings. We're animals. We need to eat, right? And what have we done? We've established, sort of engineered our country so that all of our food is sort of produced in the middle, Ohio being, a perfect example of that, and then needing to be shipped to, the edges of our country where we've all chosen to basically populate. I'm generalizing here, but yes, Paula.
Delaware City right now is going through a little bit of turmoil with city council. We're not allowed to have any chickens.
No chickens in Delaware City. God forbid, because have you seen what chickens will do to a young child, for instance? Right? Horrifying. But, the way we've come to do agriculture in this country, you can sort of understand in some ways why we don't want it next to us. But that's obviously not the only way that we can do food. It doesn't have to be like that. And I would actually argue that if we sort of moved it back into our communities, all of a sudden there would be probably a real desire to see it done in a way that wasn't quite so freaking disgusting, frankly. We would want to see it done in a way that was appealing to, if not, it was actually something that we wanted to live around. And money, I meant to mention back when I was showing you that straight line food system, there's another system in this country that operates in a straight line. And it actually is, I think, perhaps even more influential. It's probably what actually has created the industrial or dominant food system, and it's that we have an industrial money system. And so the same sort of straight line that our food travels along, that's kind of what happens with money in our economy right now, particularly when it blows through our rural communities in one end and out the other. So I promised I would address the whole issue of sustainable agriculture again. And so this is generally the point at which I start to talk about that a little more. And I guess as you probably have already figured out, I'm not a huge fan of the term sustainable agriculture, in part because I think we're not thinking nearly critically enough about what that really means, but also in part because I think it fails to define what the potential actually is. So the root of to sustain is to maintain. I don't know. How many people in here, this is a sincere question, how many people here are feeling like pretty happy about the status quo in this country? Right. That's why I asked the question. No one ever raises their hand. It's like the prostitute question, But, the root of to sustain is to maintain. I think we can do a lot better. And I'm just going to show you really quickly what I mean by that. This one, I'm just going to leave this up for the rest of the talk, if you don't mind. This is by far my favorite slide. No, we have a healthcare crisis, not even a healthcare crisis. We do have a healthcare crisis. We have a healthcare crisis in part because we have a health crisis in this country. So since 1970, we have literally a tripling, in 40 years, right? That I was born in 71. So in my life, I know that must make me seem ancient to you guys, but in my lifetime, we have in some age groups seen a tripling in the rate of obesity and type 2 diabetes, right? 3 times in 40 years. You know, there are a lot of factors that go into this, no question. Don't get me wrong. But I do not think that it is a coincidence that 1970 is also when we shifted toward an agricultural subsidy program that encouraged fence-row to fence-row farming, right? And the production of calories, of utmost calories at all costs. That is what our model is predicated on right now, is producing as much food as possible. And unfortunately, what happens is that food ends up being, you know, they produce as much food of the lowest quality denominator that can be profitable as possible. Does that make sense? I'm not sure, but I think you get my point. And so we are, yes, producing a lot of calories right now in this country. We're just not producing a lot of nutrition. It's a very different, there's a difference, big difference between calories and nutrition. Not if you're starving, but if you're well-fed, like most Americans are, there's a huge difference. Restores transparency, all right? We have a food system right now that is almost totally opaque. About 3 years ago, there was a big salmonella outbreak in eggs. Does anyone remember that? Came out of Galt, Iowa, Roger DeCoster's egg farm out of Galt, Iowa. So the CDC has all these programs that sort of track outbreaks of foodborne illness. They knew 4 months prior to figuring out where that was coming from that they had a problem. It took them 4 months with all of this incredible sort of technology to figure out what the source of this salmonella was. And so there's no transparency in our food system because our food system is totally Byzantine. It's really convoluted and complex. You got food being conglomerated from all sorts of different sources made into these processed products. That one egg farm was providing eggs to 17 different states under 16 different brands, right? It's just, I mean, how many of you think how many of you could tell me everything that you ate yesterday? Never mind, were you fasting? No. Do you, okay, so tell me one thing you ate.
One thing?
Yeah.
All right, so for breakfast I had banana and oatmeal.
Okay, great. So tell me what you had for lunch.
For lunch I had a salad, cheeseburger, and fries.
Okay, great. So I just want to give you one quick example. In that cheeseburger alone, very likely was meat from literally dozens of different animals, right? And that cheeseburger was probably made in a facility that made literally hundreds of thousands of cheeseburgers or burgers on that same day. I'm assuming that it was from the cafeteria here, or it was it started out as a frozen patty. Maybe it didn't. Maybe you went down to your local butcher and had him grind a nice piece of fresh chuck, and you took that home, and maybe you got so hungry you ate it raw on the way home. I don't know. But, the point I'm trying to make is even things that we think of as being sort of simple, basic ingredients are comprised of multiple ingredients, or in that case, multiple animals. So all it would have taken is one of those animals to have, been a carrier of, a bacterium that would make you sick. But it would be very difficult to track because you would have to figure out, what facility those animals were probably slaughtered in different facilities. It might have even been literally in different countries. I'm not kidding. Just a sec. Despite this talk, I actually think that the issue of foodborne illness is a little overblown in this country and that we should be thinking much more holistically about food safety. And let me tell you why. According to the CDC, every year about 3,000 Americans die from, eating a bad hamburger or whatever, acute foodborne illness. And those are definitely like really tragic deaths, don't get me wrong. But according to the Harvard School of Public Health, every year, 1,051,000 Americans die from diet-related disease. I would argue that those are also tragic deaths. And that strictly from a numbers perspective, we should be thinking much more holistically about food safety. Unfortunately, what happens is our fear over those 3,000 deaths tends to drive regulation in a way that continues to sort of consolidate and produce the kind of food that makes those 1,051,000 people sick to the point where they die. Yes, I know you had your hand up. Yeah, I would say it's common knowledge, but I would also say, particularly if that's the source of your beef, there's no question. I think that's right. But I also think that you know, most of the food industry would really like all of us to believe that the consumer bears the blame for not preparing this stuff correctly, and that it doesn't, you know, it doesn't have to be a situation where we have to be, you know, so fearful of our food that we got to nuke it to, you know, the nth degree in order to, you know, to kill all the bacteria. There's another issue here that's totally fascinating that could be its whole other conversation. But what happens when we start trying to kill off all the bad bacteria, so-called bad bacteria in our food, right, is that we also kill off the bacteria that makes us well. All right? I don't know how many of you know, but you guys are all teeming with E. coli right now, right? Totally. We all are. We're covered and full of bacteria. This is funny because I was just in the bathroom here, actually. No, this is not going to get any more personal than that. But there's a sign on the mirror that says about washing. They have this in the women's room too, about washing your hands because there's E. coli.
Don't respect that.
Okay, right. Well, anyway. The point I want to make is it says something about, you know, wash your hands, E. coli is everywhere or something. There are like 700 species of E. coli and like 3 that can make you sick. Every one of us has been populated with E. coli since the day of our birth. It's essential to our well-being. So what happens as we try to sort of sequester ourselves from bacteria to avoid the so-called, you know, bad bacteria is that you can't really do that without avoiding the good bacteria. And there's actually amazing research going on right now that there's links to certain bacteria and actually mostly the absence of certain particular bacteria in humans and a direct connection to a number of different conditions and diseases because the bacteria actually are making us well. So it's a really interesting conversation about, you know, what are our expectations for bacteria in our food and the risks that we're willing to take to have exposure to the bacteria that actually makes us healthy. Anyway, let's see. Oh yeah, I get back to the soil. You know, this is fascinating to me. It's like, as far as I'm concerned, I know I'm biased, but this is like something that should be on the front page of the New York Times or even Fox News. What the hell? You know, we are losing topsoil in the breadbasket of this nation, including Ohio, at a rate 30 times greater than natural replenishment, right? And so once it's gone, it's not like it's gone forever, but it's gone for a very, very long time. That topsoil, again, is the source of all of this food that we're all consuming. It's the source, essentially, of everything. Local economies, restoring local economies. So there are numerous studies out there that show, like, the potential, you know, what happens when you spend $1, for instance, at, what's the supermarket chain out here? You were telling me, what is it? Kroger's, right, or wherever it is, and you go get your, whatever your weakness is. I like those little pastries, but so when you go and spend $1 at Kroger's, you're about 15 cents to 20 cents of that dollar stays in your community. If you go to a farmer's market and you put that money directly in the hands of a producer, about 50 to 65 cents of that dollar stays in your community. So I thought for the economists in the crowd, I thought I would just sort of run some numbers based on some of the figures we have from Ohio, for instance. We know that in Ohio, per capita direct sales, so this is not all sales of local food, okay, but this is sales, you know, directly to farmer, to producer, okay? If I had all sales of local food, I would do it, but this is what I have. Per capita direct sales is $4.70. So that means that for every person in Ohio every year, there's $4.70 spent direct to producer, all right? So we know that Ohioans, but can I say Buckeyes? What about, no, that doesn't work. Shit, sorry. Anyway, we know that y'all here, how many people here from Ohio? Yeah, so you guys, this will make you feel better about your prospects. You guys have a per capita personal income of $37,836. All right, so for every man, woman, and child in Ohio, there is from all sources of income, there is almost $38,000 earned. Now, of course, that's not very equally distributed. Some people are way, 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 way less than that, and some people are way, 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 way more than that. But that's the average. So if you use the 9.5% average that Americans spend of their budget on food, you come up with about $3,600 that you all are spending on food every year. So if you were, say, to devote just 5%, all right, of your food budget to direct-to-producer sales, it would be about $180 a year. So that's up from $4.70, right? And we're still only talking 5%, which I find to be totally reasonable myself. But and you can see the impact there. We're talking over $2 billion in sales, right? If you went up to, say, 10%, radical notion, I know, but I still think it could be done. $4 billion, and I know this is kind of pie in the sky, but I think it's, that's actually, my number's wrong there. That's supposed to be a 9, not a 5. My apologies. So, we could get close. If people in Ohioans, would devote a quarter of their food budget to buying from local producers, we'd be looking at like $10 billion in economic activity in the state. It's not going to happen next year, but maybe the one after that. And for every $1 million spent by tourists in Ohio, there's 12 jobs created. And I know that tourism may not be perfectly analogous to agriculture, but again, these are the numbers I have to work with. And you can see the potential there for job creation just based on those numbers. So if we were to ramp up local food spending, the potential to create economic opportunity and revival is actually really, really quite high, even if you figure there's got to be some slop in these numbers, because I don't have perfect figures. Community, restorative community, restorative agriculture. On average, Americans move every 5 years, right? That's kind of stunning if you think about it. It's very sort of unique. It doesn't happen in many countries. I think sometimes we think of it as a good thing. We have this incredible mobility to go wherever we want, and in some ways maybe that is a good thing. But in a lot of ways it's not a good thing, because it makes it really, really hard to have an engaged community and a community that really cares about its future when people are moving every 5 years. This is just sort of anecdotal what has happened on the ground in my community. We've created over 100 jobs in the past few years. And the other one that I think is really interesting, the one I think is most interesting, is perhaps the last one, which is that we have a lot of young people in an area where young people felt like they had no future only maybe 10 years ago. We now see that a lot of them are staying around to work in these businesses, and a lot of them are actually coming to the area specifically because they want to be involved in small-scale, so-called sustainable agriculture. Just a couple more quick words, and I would love to have a little conversation if anyone's inclined to stick around. There's a lot of talk, particularly in Vermont, about value-added agriculture, value-added food products. The idea that you're going to take, cheese is a perfect example, you're going to take milk, a commodity food product, and you're going to turn it into cheese or yogurt or something like that. And I think value-added food products are a really important part of a regional food system and our future agriculturally. But I also think when we start to address all those tough issues like access, we're not going to really see that transformative change as a culture until we stop sort of asking what the value is that we can add to food and agriculture, and start asking what the value that food and agriculture add to our lives is. And so I would like to thank you all for your time. I really appreciate you all coming out. Any other points of conversation? Any questions? Yes?
What's your general opinion on GMOs?
My general opinion, real quick, on GMOs. My general opinion is to kind of, I'm going to make it real quick, tragedy. Yeah, there we go. Anyone else? Yes?
Yeah, you mentioned that you have windmills in your house.
Mm-hmm.
I just wondered, what's the, how much energy do those produce in comparison to like your solar panels?
The solar panels probably produce 90% of our energy. The windmills are actually, or we have one windmill. It's pretty small. It's a little bit of a disappointment, to be totally honest. The one nice thing about the windmill is it does produce energy when we really need it. So in the summertime, for instance, like our house is, so for those of you who don't know, our house is totally off grid. We're not connected to the utilities at all, the electrical grid at all. So we use solar photovoltaic panels and a windmill to charge batteries that we then can draw off of, like when it's dark or cloudy or whatnot. So in the summer, when we got long days and the sun's really high, our batteries will be like fully charged by noon, and even sometimes earlier. And the rest of the time, you're just kind of wasting all that. There's no way to we just don't have the capacity to capture all that. In the winter, of course, that's not the case. It's probably like Ohio in some ways. And so when the wind does spectrum of the pretty small. It's pretty small. And part of that is because we went pretty low with ours. So we live in this really rural community. I'll tell you another little story here. We live in this really rural community, and we went down to get a zoning. We had to get a zoning variance for our windmill because it was going to be higher than 35 feet. And the guy down there, he's like, "Oh," I said, "I want to apply." I said, "Carlton," his name's Carlton. I said, "Well, Carlton, I want to apply for a zoning variance for our windmill." He goes, "Oh, you don't want to do that." I said, "No, I do." He's like, "No, you really don't want to do that." I'm like, "All right." He goes, "Why don't you just put it up? And as long as no one complains, I'm not going to bother you." So, I mean, what are you supposed to do with that information, you know? It's like, I'm going to go spend $5,000 on this thing that I hope no one complains. So, long and short of it is we sort of took his advice, but we didn't put it up as high as we would have. So we only put it up 65 feet. And I think if it had gone higher, it would have done more. And no one's complained. So, yeah. There's a saying, I'm a Vermonter, I do what I want to. It's good. It's enough reason to move to Vermont right there. Yeah. I don't know. Someone raised their hand. Was he? Yeah, okay.
I was just wondering, you said you noticed that the development of this regional food economy in Hardwick is keeping people in Hardwick. Do you notice that it's attracting people?
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's no question about it. I'm sorry. Oh, yeah, to live there and to start businesses. And this is where, well, you're on Chapter 6. I don't know if you've gotten to some of the, the tension, or you're on Chapter 6. My apologies. Right. You should be on Chapter 6 at least. Right. Okay. Right. Okay. So, I mean, this is the thing that some people were afraid of. They don't want this town to change that much. And I can understand that. It's like with sort of economic opportunity, economic opportunity has this sort of funny way of not lifting all boats equally, if you know what I'm saying. And so some people, I think, are worried about what may happen to Hardwick. It's one of the reasons I like to be really honest about some of those tensions and challenges when I talk about this, because I don't want everyone to think that this is just like a panacea. It's, well, what do you mean by actively? There are people who are very outspoken about it, to me. Yeah, yeah. And I think I understand, because, like, if it were my town that I lived in, I would probably be a little nervous about it too. I mean, I think I think there's a lot of good things happening, and there's a sense of sort of like vibrancy in town, and there's more, sort of arts things going on, and there's just like, you go down there on a Friday night, it used to be, there'd be, not really much of anybody, and now there's like people hanging out in the street talking, and so there's stuff happening that's really kind of cool and exciting, but it's a mixed bag, I think. Yes.
So I'm curious about what Caitlin started here in terms of changes. I mean, in some ways, and I'm just making it, I don't know, this could maybe not be anywhere near the truth, but it almost sounds like a rural form of gentrification.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm wondering what are the tensions, because I've lived in that kind of
Right.
small town
Right.
America, that people don't want it to change, but part of what they don't want it to change is the class.
Yes.
So
Yes.
I'm curious about how much of that is a part of the tension, and in some ways, are there people who would sort of quote unquote, fight it because it's a kind of change that's going to take them out of their comfort zone and their class.
Okay, so how much of that is part of the tension? I would say about 98.9% or something. I mean, I think that's kind of what you're talking about. I mean, here we had, and have still really, a community where there's not a lot of economic stratification. Okay, so yes, it's an economically challenged community, but there's not a lot of variance. And so, I mean, my belief is that so long as you're warm and fairly well fed and you got a roof over your head, for the most part, poverty is an issue of comparativeness, of comparison, And so if most of the people that you surround yourself with are in the same sort of socioeconomic status as yourself, and assuming that no one's cold and hungry, then I think people, generally don't tend to feel terribly poor. But what happens when all of a sudden you throw into that mix, a handful of people who, I don't know, instead of making $30,000 a year, they're making 70, right? Instead of driving a 10-year-old, Chevy pickup truck, they're driving, a 2-year-old BMW. I don't know. I think that is when you start to see issues of sort of classism rear their head. And I think that, I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth, but I definitely think that is one of the concerns from some of the people who are concerned that, this, Hardwick being sort of put on the map as this sort of local food mecca. That's one of the things that may come of this. If these businesses, and I've heard, I know these people who are running these businesses, I've heard them talk about like, we're going to be having to hire, management positions, and okay, well, in one sense, that's really great, except is there anyone in Hardwick qualified for that? Well, in some cases not. So they're hiring in people from out of town to take the management positions that are paying $60,000 and $70,000 a year. At the same time, there are a lot of people in the community who are getting hired on, at very livable wages. And most Hardwickians have had to travel far outside town for employment. It's a mixed bag. I mean, the reality is, I sort of look at like that whole my 4 commandments there. It's like local food's going to feed the locals. So that's a really nice idea, and I think in an ideal world that would be the case. But most people in Hardwick, most people in Delaware, most people everywhere have mortgages and bills to pay, and so does local food have to be solely about local nourishment? Should it and can it also be part of that be a driver of the local economy? Even if that food is getting shipped to wherever, I think it's an interesting question, and what is the balance there? What's the proper? I don't know. I'm here to tell you I don't know very much. I think it's complicated, frankly. Yeah, especially when you start getting into the socioeconomic issues. I think it's really complicated. Any other comments, questions? Yo, thank you all very much. I really appreciate it.